So now I would like to invite up Sean McAllister. So Sean is a lawyer from Colorado, and he is the go-to guy when we talk about marijuana DUI. And when we talk about legalization and tax and regulate in California, two huge issues that are brought to our attention a lot are what about the kids and what about driving? So I think it's really important for us to think honestly and evidence-based about the issue of marijuana and driving and DUI. And, is the nanogram thing a real thing? Should we be looking at this? Should we be looking at other ways to attest impairment? So I will invite Mr. McAllister to come up and talk some more about marijuana DUI. We don't have a presentation, so I'm wondering if there's a way to blank this. Now we do want this screen blanked. I'm going to do that.
All right, who the hell am I? Let's see, another Colorado person. I feel like I'm having a flashback to the 90s, although here we are. It could be Denver with Jonathan and Joel and so many great people, but that's one of the fun things about being at the frontier. You get invited to speak a lot. So let's see, who am I? Today I am the lead member of a 3-member law firm, myself and 2 associates in Denver, Colorado. And we proudly split our work between dispensary representation of about 20 or 30% of the dispensaries in the state of Colorado over the last 5 years, half of our work. The other half is still criminal defense, because you as a criminal defense lawyer. My clients used to be criminals, now they're entrepreneurs. And it's a great satisfaction for me to be part of this movement, to be here in front of DPA. I remember I was telling Lynn that even though I look younger, I'm 42. I was there in the mid-'90s at the Linda Smith Center conventions in New Mexico, and to see the progress of this movement over the last 15 or 20 years has been so fulfilling. I went to the University of Colorado Law School in '96 because I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. What I found when I got there is that the social justice issues ignited my fire. The fact that Colorado had gone from 5,000 inmates to 20,000 in 20 years. Everything you all see here in California, being the leaders on mass incarceration, you know the story. But it was friends of mine that, literally 6 months after leaving a house, that got busted for 7 plants, that spent $25,000, multiple felonies in the system for years and years on end. That kind of thing people take personally, and you here in California know that as well. So I was fortunate enough in 2004 to be asked by Marijuana Policy Project to start a nonprofit in Colorado. Myself and Brian Vicente started Sensible Colorado, that ended up running most of these campaigns, helping start SAFER. It's been quite a ride. So out of that work, one of the first things Sensible Colorado did was go and ask the legislature, way before it was cool in 2004, we said, let's have a sentencing commission. Let's look at criminal justice. And Colorado was fortunate to start one of those commissions, like a lot of states have. And what came out of that was the Colorado Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, the CCJJ. So I'm sure you've had this in California and in other states. It's a great way to bring stakeholders together and have prosecutors and defense attorneys and public health professionals, all sides of the table present, and to discuss issues and find common ground. And again, Colorado has been a leader not just on the marijuana issue, but on criminal justice reform in general. Just like the individual said here earlier, our prison populations are finally going down in Colorado. We're finally closing prisons. But part of what came out of that commission, in addition to some great bills on other drugs, was a drug policy task force. And I was fortunate enough to be asked to be the DUID. Next thing you know, you're the co-chair of the DUID marijuana task force. And so I guess I've been asked to come today to tell you my story. It's really my John Kerry story about how it was for something before I was against something. Because I literally walked into a drug policy task force meeting and I didn't know it was on the agenda. I'm a busy defense attorney, and I walk into a hailstorm of basically the stereotypical treatment provider who says marijuana is addictive, it kills people on the roads, we have to have a DUID standard. And, I grew up in the South, and I always tell this story that, my instinct on this is absolutely people should not be driving high. I mean, here I am, I was running this nonprofit that's seeking legalization. The number one issue people hate is this issue of driving impaired. And, I was really terrified by my radical fringe friends who would step out and say, I drive better high, and we don't need DUI laws. This is ridiculous. I'm a better driver high. I've been driving high for 40 years. I've never had an accident. So, when I literally first heard this, I'll never forget the day, I literally said, well, I want to look at the science, but if the science supports it, I'm behind it. And I took a lot of flack for that. I'll never forget standing up in front of a room, 500 people as we're moving towards legalization. Remember in Colorado, we tried it in 2010. It failed 41 to 59. It was a just legalization of an ounce initiative. But the bottom line is stand up in front of a room, and everybody's asking about DUI, and I said, if you stand up and say that you drive better high and that there shouldn't be any standard, that's irresponsible. That's degrading the movement. We're never going to pass an initiative with that kind of mentality. And I took a lot of flack for that. But, at that time in 2009, 2010, what we were being told is, oh, Marilyn Hustis at NIDA and Health and Human Services, all the experts have looked at this, and no one could ever test over 3 nanograms. There's never been any incidents of somebody 3 to 6 hours after use testing over 3 nanograms. So, again, in a world of lay people, I'm not a scientist. I play one in court sometimes, but in a world of lay people, that sounds reasonable. Okay, no one's ever tested over 3. Okay, well, then a 5 nanogram standard seems kind of reasonable. So, yeah, okay, I'll support that. What I was supporting in 2009, what I thought the recommendation of our committee was, well, that could be a standard that could be an inference of some type of impairment that a defendant would be able to rebut. So what ended up happening is, again, my long story about how I was John Kerry who supported it before I opposed it, that came out of our committee. I thought it's a dead ringer in the legislature in 2010. Surely these guys will pass this bipartisan committee. And the most amazing thing happened. Activists came out of the woodworks. They stepped up and testified about chronic marijuana, medical marijuana patients, and they're concerned they'll never be able to drive again. And the legislature did the right thing in 2010. It defeated that bill. Summer 2010, we really got serious. That's when we brought in all the experts from around the world. I really finally, for the first time, dug into this science. We talked to Jan Ramakers, the world's leading researcher on this issue in Holland. Let's just talk some basics. I'm sorry I don't have slides. I'm sort of animated. Sometimes I can be entertaining. But the bottom line is, the marijuana impairment is a very basic thing. It's a very steep bell curve, shoots straight up upon use, and then it quickly dissipates over time. Really, most of the impairment for marijuana is in the first hour of use. And what's interesting about marijuana is the impairment is not correspond with the blood levels. So everybody says, well, it's just like alcohol. If you've got this blood level, then you're impaired. That is absolutely true for alcohol. The blood-brain barrier for alcohol is totally permeable. If you have alcohol in your blood, you have it in your brain. There is no distinction there. And I owe a lot of credit to a lot of this science, understanding this, to Paul Armentano at Normal, who's a great resource. If you ever want to talk more about this, please feel free to talk to Paul. But the difference with marijuana is that peak, it shoots straight up, but that's not the highest point of impairment. That's the highest point in your blood when you use it initially in the first 10 minutes. But impairment lags the peak point in your blood. And so the fact that as soon as you use, it shoots straight up, what we find is impairment is more in the 15 to 45 minute, 60 minute range rather than that initial 10 minutes when it spikes in your blood. It's also true that the level in your blood, first it lags, and then there's residual presence of THC in your blood over time. So I think if you talk to the scientists, you'll see that the fact that, and I've seen this personally in cases, that someone may actually have 5, 6, 10 nanograms in their system a long time after they've used marijuana. Every expert in the world, I've had state toxicologists on the stand, and they will all say the same thing. Marijuana impairment lasts 1 to 4 hours if smoked, maybe up to 8 hours if ingested with edibles. Okay, great. So that would mean logically that Marilyn Hustis, Jan Ramakers, all these experts agree 1 to 4 hours. Carl Hart at Columbia says really 1 hour. Fine. Nobody should be impaired more than 8 hours, right? That's what all the experts have said. I had a case this year, a guy in Boulder, classic, we'll call him John Doe. Mr. Doe tested at a 9 nanogram level. So we said, okay, I'm going to run my own experiment because we know what's going to happen if I go to trial. The state toxicologist is going to say we have a 5 nanogram standard. I'm sorry I'm bouncing around here, but everybody should also know 14 states have per se standards. 10 of those are zero tolerance, meaning any metabolite, any amount of marijuana in the blood is impairment. 4 of those have specific standards, usually 1 or 2 nanograms is the most common number. Colorado has 5, Washington has 5. So this is an issue. I know California right now doesn't have one, and we're all very hopeful that 2016 will put a stake in the heart of this prohibition. But the bottom line is, we knew if we go to trial that this guy, the toxicologist would say he was high because 9 nanograms. Okay, so what did we do? We hired some people, monitored him for 4 hours. Now, this guy told me he smokes all the time, 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. So we said, okay, come into our office. We're going to have a person monitor you for zero use for 4 hours. That should really put you at baseline. As I said, that bell curve shoots up. 3 to 4 hours later, you should be back at baseline. In addition, after the 4 hours, we tested him every hour for the next 4 hours. When we got those results back, the results at hour 5, so 4 hours with no use, 1 hour additional, he was tested. Hour 5 was 10. Hour 6 was 9. Hour 7 was 11. Hour 8 was 9 again. So, this idea that marijuana is metabolized by everybody equally and therefore 5 nanograms is a fair standard because nobody could show up over 5 more than 3 or 4 hours after use, it clearly hasn't been studied enough. There was also another individual that came to the legislature, I think it was in 2010, it was the same thing. It was one of the things that killed the bill. He showed up with a blood result 8 hours after smoking at 13 nanograms. I never saw that test was really done under a controlled environment, but the bottom line is that's when it all changed for me. Also, I asked Jan Romakers, the expert, I said, okay, what is the number that everybody is definitely impaired at? Because Romakers will admit that blood THC content alone cannot tell you if somebody is impaired. Again, marijuana is fat soluble. It basically acts like a time-release pill that will release marijuana over time. And because blood doesn't correlate with brain impairment on marijuana, you will have people that show these high residual numbers. So Jan Romakers' answer is 15 is a number that he would feel, well, first of all, he said that would be a number I would feel comfortable that everybody at 15 would certainly have to be impaired at that time. That's sort of his intuitive thing. So, the issue in Colorado and a lot of these states, Washington's different. I mean, first, everybody needs to understand there's 3 choices for marijuana impairment standards. You could have just a narrative standard, which is what we had before this 5 nanograms was enacted. In Colorado, you're guilty of DUI if you're substantially incapable of safely operating a motor vehicle. We're also one of 15 states that has a lower standard, narrative standard called DWAI. It says that you're impaired even to the slightest degree. Most states just have DUI, 0.08 for alcohol, now 5 nanograms in Colorado for marijuana. But having that lower standard of impaired even to the slightest degree, I mean, there already is a law in Colorado that says if you are impaired to that you're guilty of driving under the influence. And so that would be one option, just a narrative standard. The second option would be what we have in Colorado. We do not have a per se standard in Colorado. We have a rebuttable presumption. So what is a rebuttable presumption? A rebuttable presumption means that in a normal criminal case, the prosecutor has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt this person is guilty. But in this instance, it shifts the burden to the defendant. It says, if you were over this number, we presume you were impaired. And then it's your burden to prove that you're not really impaired. My complaint with the Colorado standard or any state that adopts these rebuttable presumptions, that was what ultimately got it done, by the way, in Colorado. So let me just jump through this really quick. The bottom line is we went through this committee in the summer of 2010. We heard all that science I just talked about. Can't tell us for sure nanograms. The committee deadlocked 4-4 and said, we don't know. Nobody can agree here. Based on that deadlock, the legislature killed the bill again in 2011. 2012, we legalized recreational marijuana, and guess what? Then the legislators felt a lot of public pressure to do something about it, and this bill, like a zombie, just kept coming back and kept getting resuscitated. The law enforcement people were going to get this deal at the end of the day. They finally got it in 2012. And so what it does is shifts the burden to the defendant to prove that they're not impaired even though they're over 5 nanograms. I mean, my complaint with that is that we have a system of justice that says you must be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So you would think if we're going to shift the burden of who's responsible for proving guilt, that our proof, our science, should also be beyond a reasonable doubt. And I just don't think we've reached ultimately what this debate comes down to. What you'll hear on the other side is that, look, we heard the same things about alcohol. Everybody said, I can drink a case of beer and I'm fine to drive. I have a high tolerance. Just because I'm over a 0.08 or a 0.1 doesn't mean that I'm impaired. And so we heard the same thing, and we need to set the standards sufficiently low to deter this conduct. You know, the proponents of these standards are relying on an argument that is, it's okay to punish some innocent people because it's more important to really send the strong message here. And I can understand that logic. The problem I have with it is it really is inapplicable to this debate. In alcohol, like we said, if you're 0.08 in your blood or your breath, that's what's in your brain. But with marijuana, it actually is not the same thing. You are impaired to some degree with alcohol in your blood at any time. But that is not the case. And so my complaint about these standards is, first of all, they don't protect the presumption of innocence. They shift the burden. But, you know, they definitely are going to convict innocent people. And that is what I see all day. That guy that I mentioned that had the 9, 10, 11 over 8 hours, ultimately the decision for him was, am I going to spend another $10,000, you know, some of that on me, but a lot of that on an expert to have to come in and explain to the jury what do these numbers mean and how does this play out? Am I going to have to spend that extra $10,000, or should I just suck it up and do some classes? And ultimately, at the end of the day, he wimped out and chose. And I don't mean it to say that way. He chose not to spend the extra money. I've had other clients go all the way to trial and win the case. But what I see is basically the apartheid of justice. I mean, this is about if you have money and you can hire the experts, you can convince a jury that these numbers don't mean anything. But if you don't have the resources, and again, the social justice aspect, it definitely creates a dichotomy of who gets justice and who doesn't. So I know I'm long-winded. That was this was the presumptive inference standard that I was just talking about. The other standard would just be a per se standard. We already have a per se standard in Colorado for alcohol. So it just means if you hit that number, all the state has to prove is that you hit that number, not that you were really impaired. There's no rebuttable presumption. For alcohol in Colorado, if they can show the test was valid, that showed you were over 0.08, you're guilty. That is clearly the extreme and the worst kind of law you could have. I think our law was a compromise. I know Representative Singer worked on this, and I understand the desire to have these standards. It is important. But what's really standard for marijuana impairment are the roadside exams. And so, we haven't talked about this. The SFSTs, the Standard Field Sobriety Tests, there's really only 3 tests that are clinically validated, and these were initially done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, mostly for alcohol, but since there have been research to show that these have some validity basically for any kind of impairment. And the 3 tests are the nystagmus gaze test, the pin in front of your eye, the one-leg stand, and the walk and turn. Now, nystagmus gaze is irrelevant for marijuana. You get people to say, oh, he was high on marijuana because there was nystagmus gaze. It doesn't show marijuana impairment. Even vertical nystagmus, which is another type of test, is irrelevant towards marijuana impairment. So really, in the U.S., we have 2 tests that potentially show marijuana impairment, the one-leg stand and the walk and break. You guys should all try to stand on your leg, one leg, with your arms out by your side, count to 30, and not sway more than 3 inches. Because if you do that and you sway more than 3 inches or do what I just did and put my foot down, you have failed the one-leg stand and you are impaired. And that's the problem, is our alternatives right now for marijuana testing are really poor, because we know that 30% of people who fail the roadside exams are actually not impaired, which of course gives me great arguments in front of a jury that, hey, this is not legitimate. 30% of the people who fail these roadside tests. But you start hearing as a jury, well, 5 nanograms and he failed the roadside test and smells like it, looks like it, he's guilty. We heard from the legislature when I testified, that would be marijuana on this. Oh, wait a second, what's the problem with these standards? If you're not impaired, you're not going to get pulled over, you're not going to get arrested, okay? Here's the simplest explanation of how an innocent person is convicted being totally unimpaired. You have a taillight out, so you get pulled over. You weren't driving poorly. Maybe you forgot to put your blinker on. I'm sure none of you do that, right? You get pulled over for an innocent driving error. The cop comes to the car. Because of the prevalence of medical marijuana now, of course, people are much more open about what they have and what they do. And the first thing they say is, when the cop says, "What's that marijuana I smell?" They say, "Yeah, I got some marijuana. It's right here." Or here's my red card. In Colorado, our marijuana cards are red, or used to be. So they would pull out the red card. They would show the marijuana, and the cop smells marijuana. He says, "All right, well, do you mind doing some roadsides?" So you get an innocent reason to pull over, smell of marijuana in the car. You've got somebody, for example, overweight people that are more than 50 pounds overweight have been shown not to be able to successfully complete roadsides like normal weight people. You get an overweight guy, he gets out of the car, he doesn't have very good so he's not really good on the whole stand on one leg, jump around like a monkey thing, and next thing you know, he's under arrest for DUI. So there is no doubt that innocent people are being arrested for being impaired. Again, this is a policy debate about, is it okay to punish some innocent to send the message, or what's more important to you, the preservation of innocence? Personally, I come down on, in all of our laws, it's more important to protect the innocent person. That's why we have a standard called beyond a reasonable doubt. If we were going to execute everyone accused of murder to prevent murder, I don't think we would feel good about that. Obviously, it's an extreme example, but that is the purpose of the presumption of innocence. So that's what you're giving up when you go for these laws. One of the things we saw on our commission is, well, what is the problem? You definitely heard Representative Singer say we've got declining traffic fatalities in Colorado over the last several years. We've also got a reduction in teen use. The declining fatalities, the law enforcement would say, well, we've got better engineered roads and guardrails and other developments in cars that are reducing fatalities. But what we heard during the commission was, well, look at all this evidence that there's all these increased incidents of marijuana and drivers with accidents and fatalities. Okay, it's a great claim that law enforcement can make to justify marijuana. You have to dig underneath that. What we found in Colorado was there is no systematic process in Colorado, and I doubt there is in California or many other states, for gathering impairment data on drivers. So it's a hodgepodge of, there's an accident, somebody dies, the coroner does a urine test to see what intoxicants are in the body. Sometimes it's a blood test. A blood draw is a part of a DUI case that reveals this. But, this goes back to fundamentally understanding what you're looking at. And I didn't mention it earlier, but marijuana in the urine is meaningless. It's, carboxy, THC, has no impairing effects, and you could have it in your urine for 7 to 30 days after use. If you're a chronic user, it might be 60 days after use. So these numbers that people throw out, this increased incident of marijuana in drivers and accidents and fatalities, you got to dig underneath that and see, is that really true? Because one of the recommendations we had is like, okay, like I said at the beginning of all this, if the science supports it, I'm on the side of being protective, but let's get real data. And so it's really important, if your state doesn't already, to have a systematic way for collecting this evidence and being able to determine if there really is a problem anyways. And ultimately, and I hate to be so partisan here, but we're among friends. I mean, ultimately in Colorado, what this was about is making it easier for prosecutors to get convictions. to not have to go to trial as much. I mean, that's ultimately what a DUI standard is that, okay, once we start a case that it says 5 nanograms, you are impaired, the DA is sitting over there going, you're going to take the deal or you're going to get convicted. And I'm telling my client, you're going to take the deal or again, unless you spend $10,000, even if you do that, you're going to be at risk with these juries who are very, concerned about marijuana and driving. You're going to be, facing conviction. I mean, so I think it is a problem. I don't believe that numerical standards are necessary. I think what we saw was this 94% conviction rate in Colorado without one. What's important is better roadside testing and developing other tests that can actually show impairment during that short window of 15 to 60 to 70 minutes of impairment. And Australia has done a little work on this. You keep hearing Australia has marijuana-specific roadsides, and when I finally looked into it, it's like the answer is that they decided that head jerks and head movements were indicative of marijuana impairment. What? I just never seen any data to back up this idea that the Australian roadside exams, which consider head jerks and head movements, is actually indicative of impairment at the time. I mean, it sounds like some of the other, frankly, BS I deal with in my work every day. We hear from law enforcement all day, oh, he had a green coating on his tongue, so he was impaired. My other favorite is I had a case one time where the client did exactly what I told him, except at the end. In Colorado, you don't have to take those roadsides. It's not mandatory, so I tell people, do not take that. He didn't do any of that, and I tell them, take the blood test. I can explain that to the jury. Don't worry about it. Well, he refused that too, but then right at the end, the officer said, well, can I take your pulse? Would you mind? I was like, yeah, you could take my pulse. So she takes his pulse and says, oh, he had a slightly elevated pulse, therefore he's high. I mean, these kind of indicators of green tongue, slightly elevated pulse, head jerks, it just seems like quackery to me. And we don't really have a systematic study on what actual physical tests are the best for impairment, because everybody agrees that the actual physical testing is more relevant. I mean, I could show you studies from NIDA and other National Highway Transportation Safety Administration that say use of blood quantum alone as an indicator of impairment is nearly impossible. And yet, in spite of that, we've got the witch hunt on. Marilyn Hustis at NIDA, who's that office is politically controlled. Her research actually has to be approved by the drug czar. The drug czar's office that has suggested that every state have a numeric limit. Her line is that people are impaired off marijuana for 24 hours. That if you smoke marijuana today, you will be impaired tomorrow. And somebody's going to stop me if I'm going too long. But okay, one more minute, right? So the bottom line is, if you really dig into these studies, this is what shows that we have a lot more work to do. Because yes, are there studies that say people who use marijuana are impaired? We all agree, when you use marijuana, you're impaired. The question is, when does impairment end? And these claims that impairment could last 24 hours, they're simulated tests on a machine where you're standing in front of this thing, and if a square comes up, you hit the red button. If a triangle comes up, you hit the square button. And the reaction time is slower among people who use marijuana chronically 24 hours later. The question is your ability to punch a green button versus a red button on a blip screen the same as your impairment of your ability to drive? And that's why, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration in the late 90s and even mid-2000s said that use of marijuana is equivalent to taking an antihistamine as far as impairment, or penicillin. Paul Armentano correlates it to potentially distracted driving. I mean, there is no doubt that there are things that we do in our cars, looking at our cell phones or anything else, that shouldn't probably that potentially are impairing you. The question is, why do we have special standards for marijuana? I have a case right now of a woman who has a lot of mental health things going on and had a lot of pharmaceuticals on board. The only standards we have in Colorado are for alcohol and marijuana. I don't have a standard for Oxycontin. I don't have a standard even for cocaine or heroin or any of these other things, or certainly any of the pharmaceuticals. So we have a long way to go, and what's going to happen is some type of legal challenge that right now it hasn't happened in Colorado. You got to find the right person, but it'll be interesting to see what the courts do with it. I'm concerned the erosion of the Fourth Amendment over the last 40 years, that these standards will likely be upheld, and so we do need to work at the legislative level to get these right. Very concerned about where we're at now. All right, thank you.
So the DUI issue is a very, very complex one, and it's something that we don't necessarily have an answer to, but is also not a reason to not move forward with changing marijuana policies and looking for better solutions.